Hello everyone and welcome to the ISCA Contractors Working Group webinar on developing a business case for sustainability initiatives in infrastructure. My name is Nicole Neal and I am co-chair of the Contractors Working Group. I'll be presenting this webinar along with my working group colleagues Rick Walters, my co-chair, and Glenn Hedges, who was co-chair when we produced the guide. The Contractors Working Group identified that one of the key barriers to the uptake of sustainability initiatives within the infrastructure and construction sector was, or is still, the perceived costs and thereby the perceived difficulties in developing business cases to demonstrate the benefits of sustainability initiatives. As such, the Contractors Working Group developed a guide, Developing a Business Case for Sustainability Initiatives in Infrastructure, a how-to guide, and that's available on the resources page of the ISCA's website, to support practitioners in preparing effective business cases. You can find the how-to guide right here. This tab in the resources tab and also on this thumbnail on the website. So the aim of the guide and today's webinar is to assist you in conveying the value of a proposed initiative through 8 clearly defined steps in a language that will resonate with decision makers. At the end of today's session, you should hopefully walk away with a useful framework for putting together a highly compelling business case for a sustainability initiative. And so format-wise, in today's webinar, I'll take you through each of these 8 key steps with a role-played example from Rick and Glenn. And there'll be some time for questions at the end. So, the 8 key steps. The 8 key steps in developing a sustainability-focused business case are: Step 1, define the problem or opportunity. Step 2, identify key stakeholders and their drivers. Step 3, identify the options. Step 4, describe the impact. Step 5, assess the options. Step 6, make a recommendation. Step 7, outline the action plan. And Step 8, prepare the executive summary. Over to you, Rick.
The role play is based on case study 1 from the guide. Note that this case study is hypothetical based on real information, but shouldn't be relied upon other than in regard to illustrating the methodology in the guide. No endorsements are intended to be made or implied either. I'll be playing Louis, the engineer, and Glenn will play Steve, the construction manager. As a background on the project, it's an infrastructure construction project involving significant night works. The procurement team have sought Louis, my advice and assistance in scoping and selecting a supplier to lease lighting towers for a period of 12 months. So we'll be interspersing the role play between Nicole's explanation of the process steps. Back to Nicole.
Thanks, Rick. So, on to the first step. Step 1, define the problem or opportunity. There can be somewhat of a tendency to jump straight into analysing, spruiking a potential initiative and justifying its costs and benefits. What is needed first, however, is stepping back from that and understanding and defining what it is that a potential sustainability initiative is intended to address. Otherwise, there is a significant risk of time, effort and finances being wasted solving the wrong problem, or at least providing a weak business case to decision makers. The completion of this step should result in a clear statement of the problem or the opportunity and a description of its causes and effects, its scale and extent. There are 2 elements to good problem or opportunity definition. 1, identifying the objectives and targets relevant to the proposed sustainability initiative, and 2, identifying and analysing the problem or opportunity. When looking at the first of these elements, identifying the relevant objectives and targets, consider what organisational, client or broader societal objectives and targets may not be achieved due to the problem or opportunity. What objectives and targets does the opportunity contribute to? When looking at opportunities, it may be useful to refer to the framework on page 7 of the how-to guide, which outlines common business improvement objectives and value drivers. I've got that here for you. So the second of these elements, identifying and analysing the problem or opportunity, should be based on data and information obtained from surveys, from modelling, from interviews and studies from a range of sources appropriate to the materiality of the issue in question. Problem or opportunity identification should not be confined to existing situations or issues either. Emerging and potential future problems or opportunities should also be considered. And investigate, at least at a high level, the explanations behind the problem or opportunity and identify its fundamental root causes and symptoms. Effective action can only be taken once the underlying cause and effect of a problem or opportunity are understood. So seek to develop at least a high-level understanding of the scale, the extent and the cost of the problem or opportunity. And note that the problem or opportunity definitions should be succinct. So now for the role play. As a background, the project has recently commenced and the sustainability approach is being established. Louis, the engineer, comes to see Steve, the construction manager.
Hi, Steve. I've been thinking a bit about how we're going to achieve our sustainability objectives. They're quite ambitious, you know.
What are you thinking?
Well, we have an objective to improve energy efficiency and reduce our greenhouse gas emissions during construction phase, and the target is a 20% reduction in both of these. So I was thinking that since we have so much night works to undertake, lighting is going to be a consistent energy consumption for us. While we'll need to implement a bunch of things to achieve the target, lighting could be a good place to start because whatever we do would likely be reproducible across other projects in the future. I'm aware that there are some alternative lighting towers available that use LEDs and solar, which may provide some energy savings.
Sounds interesting. Are they up for the job and will they cost more?
Well, the last job I worked on used LED lights, and I overheard a supplier saying that they're trialling solar hybrid lighting towers. So I believe the LED towers save money by using less diesel and required less maintenance. I'll have to look into the higher rates to make sure, though.
All right, go ahead and put a business case together and we'll see how the options stack up. Make sure you put some thought into the various stakeholders that will be needed to be involved.
The project has a target to achieve a 20% energy and greenhouse gas emission reduction target specific to the construction phase. Lighting towers used during night works have been identified as a significant contributor to project greenhouse gas emissions and therefore are worth targeting for reduction opportunities. That's the summary of the problem or opportunity definition, in this case, an opportunity. Back to you, Nicole.
Thanks very much, guys. So we've covered step 1, defining the problem or opportunity, and now we're on to step 2, identifying key stakeholders and their drivers. Why is this an important step? Early identification of stakeholders who can influence or potentially be impacted by a proposed sustainability initiative is essential to gain their support to address potential show-stopping issues, take on board previously unconsidered ideas or approaches, and ultimately develop a robust and compelling business case. For more complex opportunities or problems, comprehensive stakeholder identification and engagement may be beneficial to ensure that all positive and negative impacts are understood, and where desirable, that key stakeholders participate in the decision-making process. Involving stakeholders can also reinforce the objective nature of the assessment. In identifying stakeholders, look for people or groups of people who can either be impacted, either positively or negatively, by the sustainability initiative and or influence the decision-making process that your business case will be subject to. These stakeholders could include internal project team stakeholders, internal organisational stakeholders, suppliers and service providers, end users, and local community stakeholders, including residents and local businesses. When looking at the impacts of the problem or opportunity on each stakeholder, look at both the direct and indirect impacts and how these align with key stakeholder priorities and drivers. It's important that the value drivers, that is what really matters, for stakeholders are understood. Developing a business case in alignment with the priorities and broad objectives of key stakeholders is crucial in ensuring a business case has maximum impact. When looking at what matters to stakeholders, consult their strategic vision if they have one, objectives and targets where they're known, identify what motivates them and how they define or measure success. Consideration should also be given to the potentially differing value drivers of internal versus external stakeholders and the weighting given to each. Some value drivers may be the same, but there are likely others that will be distinctly different, perhaps even opposing. Prioritisation of stakeholders should be undertaken to determine who to engage with and to what extent. It may be useful to plot key stakeholders on an influence importance matrix, such as this shown. This maps stakeholders according to their influence and importance in relation to the problem or opportunity under consideration. Influence here being the level of power that a stakeholder holds over an initiative, and importance being the priority given to a particular stakeholder over others. Back to the case study.
So Louis leaves Steve's office and starts thinking about stakeholders for this initiative. So obviously Steve is a key stakeholder, and I know that he cares about a safe working environment and is very cost conscious. Then there are the foremen and the crews. They're also interested in a safe environment and reliable lighting. They might also want to ensure that the lights are easy to manoeuvre, to mobilise and operate. So it's important to involve them. It'll also be important to collaborate with suppliers. What we're asking for may be somewhat new to our industry. They want to be sure that they can make a fair profit. They'll be attracted by the opportunity to establish themselves in a new market, and they'll want to win repeat business from us. Next, there are the other managers within the project team. They'll want assurance that the alternatives meet our policies and contractual requirements. They might also be interested in other benefits, so things like noise reduction and complaint minimisation. I'll consult with them too. Local residents in the community will probably focus on noise, light and air pollution, so I'll need to keep them informed. Finally, there's our client. They seem to be pretty focused on their reputation and social licence, but are not too concerned about the details. I'll inform them once we make a decision. Back to you, Nicole.
Thanks, Rick. So we've looked at defining the problem or opportunity and then identifying key stakeholders and their drivers. We're now moving on to step 3, identifying the options. The completion of this step should result in the identification of a set of options that can be readily assessed. There are many processes that can be used to generate ideas for options, including ideation or brainstorming, design thinking and charrettes. The range of options for assessment depends on the nature and size of the problem or opportunity. For simple problems or opportunities with low impact, a small number of options may be sufficient. Otherwise, more effort should be spent on the business case and then implementing the preferred option itself. In fact, for simple problems and opportunities, it may be practical to simply consider just a single option and compare it to a base case option. For more complex opportunities and problems with high impact, it is important to consider a broad spectrum of options to ensure the most effective option is selected. There should always be a base case option to refer to. This is the do nothing or business as usual or BAU option, which describes what would happen if the opportunity was not implemented or the problem was not solved. It is recommended that, where possible, the option identification considers both capital investment and non-capital options, such as changes to procedures and practices and hiring instead of buying or building products or services. These kind of options may well have a lower life cycle cost and more beneficial outcomes. And it is important to encourage consideration of innovative solutions, even if they are untested. It is important to think outside of the scope of the construction contractor also, which may mean considering partnerships with other stakeholders, such as organisations who will inherit asset maintenance responsibilities. In some cases, the preferred initiative may seem to be clearly evident or even predetermined, and the business case is being prepared merely to obtain approval or to proceed. In this case, consideration of other options is still important because the decision maker is much more likely to be convinced by a business case that shows proper consideration of alternatives and that the preferred option is really the best one. And a very important thing to remember is this: always challenge your own ideas. Review your ideas with a neutral lens to avoid a self-fulfilling prophecy. Getting a second opinion prior to taking the business case to a decision maker can be really invaluable. Let's see how things progress with our case study.
And Louis bumps into Steve in the corridor.
Louis, how are you going with those lighting options?
I've done some investigation with some of the other engineers in our procurement team and some suppliers, and there seem to be 3 main options. Standard towers, which are business as usual option, powered by diesel generators. You're familiar with those. LED towers, which use LED lights powered by diesel generators. LED lights are more energy efficient than the standard towers, and the generator may therefore be smaller. And LED solar towers are another option. They use LED lights powered by solar panels and a diesel generator, providing a hybrid system. These towers may provide further energy benefits. The dry hire rental prices for both alternative options are more expensive than standard towers, but these costs don't include the savings from reduced fuel use and associated labour to refuel and maintain the towers.
Great to hear. I look forward to seeing the cost-benefit analysis. Back to you, Nicole.
Thanks, both. Or Rick and Glenn, should I say Louis and Steve? So we've been through defining the problem or opportunity, identifying key stakeholders and their drivers, and identifying the various options. The next step then is to describe the impacts, the costs and the benefits of the options. Identifying and describing impacts can be a complex process, but in simple terms, impacts will fall into one or more classes, as shown. Essentially, tangible and intangible. Some impacts can only be described qualitatively, or it's difficult to quantify them. These impacts are generally described as intangible or qualitative, such as social license or reputation. Some impacts are more easily quantified, and these are generally described as tangible impacts. Branching from these tangible quantitative impacts, we have quantitative non-monetized impacts. Some quantifiable impacts cannot be monetized, or it is not worth the effort to try to do so. For example, a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions of 1,000 tonnes of CO2 equivalent per annum. Also branching from quantitative tangible impacts, we have monetized impacts. Some quantifiable impacts can be monetized, such as reduced cost of using less fuel or loss of biodiversity valued at $500,000, for example. And then branching from monetized impacts, we have financial and non-financial impacts. Monetized impacts include internal financial or broader economic impacts, which are usually easily monetized, since this is the industry-accepted approach to describing them. These impacts are sometimes also described as financial. Monetizing social and environmental impacts can be more difficult. These impacts are often termed externalities or non-financial impacts, since they lie outside of a traditional financial analysis. Quantifying impacts is useful and important because it provides more detailed and comparable information to a decision maker. For example, consider two options which provide 1,000 tonnes of CO2 equivalent reduction and 1,500 tonnes of CO2 equivalent reduction respectively, for example. The second option on this impact measure at least is 50% more effective. Compare this then to two qualitative impacts, one being a loss of biodiversity and the other being a significant loss of biodiversity for two options respectively. The latter information is a lot more difficult for a decision maker to make sense of and use. Attempt to quantify impacts by expressing the impact in terms of a suitable metric. This should preferably be a standardized and industry-accepted unit. A range of non-financial business performance indicators can be used to measure social and environmental value too. These types of metrics are used in voluntary corporate reporting, such as annual sustainability reports, using metrics such as percentage of construction and demolition waste recycled or kilolitres of non-potable or potable water consumed. They're used in reporting to regulators using metrics such as tonnes of CO2 equivalent emitted or kilowatt hours of energy consumed, internal project performance reporting to parent companies or benchmarking with other projects like environmental incident frequency rates, and internal decision making such as number of defects, number of complaints, actual versus planned construction time, or target and aspirational IS rating scores. When compiling a business case, it is imperative to understand which quantitative metrics are recognised and trusted by the key stakeholders. So refer back to your second step and your key stakeholder drivers. In addition to demonstrating how the options will influence those metrics. Where metrics do not exist and need to be developed, just take a bit of caution. Attention should be paid to variances in the legitimacy or robustness of the metrics selected. When choosing metrics, choose those which can be used to compare the benefits of multiple initiatives that can be readily linked to broader project, organisational or stakeholder objectives and can be used for tracking performance of the options once implemented. So let's just come back to monetising impacts. Financial impacts are, by definition, quantified in monetary units. They traditionally form the base of a business case. But some quantitative non-financial impacts can also be monetised. Being able to monetise an impact should lead to a greater awareness of the impact and also result more readily in appropriate decision making. Monetising an impact allows it to be included in a cost-benefit analysis more readily, which we'll talk a bit more about later on, along with all financial impacts. It provides the decision maker with a real and relative sense of the magnitude of the impact. People cannot make rational decisions with incomplete information, and often what is missing is the value in the business case. That's measured and expressed in the same units as the rest of the analysis, i.e. money. For these reasons, it is desirable that impacts are monetised whenever they can be. Monetising social and environmental impacts can be difficult, can be tricky. These impacts are often termed externalities since they lie outside of traditional financial analysis, as I've said previously. Examples include noise, atmospheric and water pollution, climate change caused by greenhouse gas emissions, and severance or barrier effects. Significant progress has been made in recent years, though, in the development of statistical and survey techniques to elicit people's valuations of environmental externalities, such as hedonic pricing and contingent valuation methods. However, these techniques are far from perfect and are pre-resource intensive. While some argue that placing a monetary value on non-tangible impacts can be seen as subjective, the field of environmental economics is now reasonably well established, and with suitable care, it is possible to place a range of reasonable monetary values on a wide spectrum of environmental and social assets. In simple cases, and where particular externality costs are not critical, that is, small in relation to total impact, default externality values may be used if available. Default values are standard unit costs that can be applied across the board to obtain an estimate of externality costs. Although only a rough guide, employing a default value for an externality is usually preferable to the alternative of giving it a zero value. Default values for typical transport impacts are provided in the 2016 Australian Transport Assessment and Planning document, and there's a reference for that in the how-to guide if you want to take a look. If some externalities to your problem or opportunity are really significant, then consider obtaining or undertaking modelling or survey work to identify externalities specific to the impacts of the options. Estimate the quantities of the externalities in physical terms and then value the externalities. When valuing an externality, the aim is to find out how much the affected people are willing to pay to avoid the externality, or how much they are willing to accept to put up with it. There are a lot more details on the techniques in the how-to guide. As noted previously, there are some impacts that can only be articulated qualitatively, and defining the intangible impacts of options is also of importance, otherwise decision makers are not receiving the full picture. Qualitative or intangible impacts may include reputation, social outcomes, environmental outcomes, workforce engagement, ethical and responsible practice drivers. Clearly define and articulate the intangible impacts so that they are readily understood and their importance is made clear. Right, let's move on to talk about describing the impacts. Prepare a list of all the impacts, both the costs and the benefits for each option. This should include investment costs, cost to develop an option, capital costs to construct an option or build an option, operating costs to operate an option, revenue gained, typically during the operating life of an option, and various benefits and disbenefits, such as negative impacts or costs to society and environment. It may be useful to list the impacts for each option in 3 columns, covering A, a qualitative description, B, a quantitative description, and C, a monetised description, noting that not all of these descriptions will perhaps be necessarily available for each impact. The assessment period should aim to cover the full life cycle of the options as well. For capital projects, this should include the construction and operation periods to the end of the design life, and end-of-life deconstruction and sale or disposal, where relevant. Where options have different design lives, it is preferable to use the longest design life and include a suitable renewal allowance for options with shorter lives. Right then, back to Louis, who is now pondering the various costs and benefits of the three options.
So compare the two alternative options to the standard lighting towers. There are three groups of benefits. Qualitatively, there are reputational benefits for both options arising from energy reductions and achievement of project targets. The solar option also provides support for emerging clean technologies. From a money quantitative perspective, both options reduce refueling costs, reduce maintenance costs since the LED lights are longer lasting, and increase the hire cost. Other quantitative impacts for both options are reduced noise through the smaller generator, potential reduction in community complaints related to the noise as well, and a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. I'll need to analyse each of these impacts further. Back to Nicole.
Thanks, Rick. So we've been through defining the problem or the opportunity, identifying key stakeholders and their drivers, identifying the various options and describing the impacts of the options. We're now moving on to step 5 and assessing the options. This is about assessing and narrowing down options through a structured, objective and evidence-based process for the purpose of identifying a preferred option. The how-to guide outlines a number of tools which can help with the assessment, and what we talk about here and present in the guide is by no means a definitive list. Options should not be ruled out on the basis of personal preferences. This is worth bearing in mind. Any perceived political difficulties or in any way that precludes genuine consideration of certain options. At this step, options should be judged solely on their merit, ruled out only on the basis that they do not address the problem or opportunity in the most efficient way. Depending on the scale of the project and the list of options, the assessment process consists of a two-stage process. An optional screening assessment, followed by a more detailed assessment. Screening should be used where there is a long list of options that need to be shortlisted before undertaking a more detailed assessment. It also requires less effort than going straight to a detailed assessment with all of the long list of options. The more detailed assessment then assesses how each option creates value and/or how they deliver net benefits, i.e. benefits greater than the cost. It also identifies the option that generates the most value and/or delivers the largest net benefit. This then becomes the preferred option. There are a number of tools recommended for use in the assessment process, and they should be selected in accordance with your organisation or your project's preferences. I won't go into vast detail here on each method, because we could do a whole other webinar on that, but I'll just outline some of the available techniques briefly. So screening, and screening by checklist. This is a checklist that aligns options against goals, objectives, policies and strategies for each initiative. If an option does not align, then it can be ruled out and does not proceed to detailed assessment. This is suited to less complex problems or opportunities where there is a long list of options. There's actually an example of that for you in Appendix 1 of the How-To Guide. Multi-criteria analysis or multi-criteria assessment or NCA. This is an approach that scores options under several different criteria, which may or may not be weighted and aggregated into a single score. This is suited to more complex problems and opportunities where there is a long list of options. Moving into the more detailed assessments, we have cost-benefit analysis or CBA. This is a financial analysis process for calculating the net costs and benefits of options expressed in monetary units. Results can be expressed in a variety of metrics, including payback period, net present value or NPV, and return on investment or ROI. CBA is suited to most problems and opportunities. Rick and Glenn, at this point, will role play with a couple of these.
So Louis comes to see Steve. I've completed the cost-benefit analysis and want to take you through it. Have you got half an hour?
Sure. How did you go?
Okay, so let's look at a fairly traditional cost-benefit analysis first. I looked at the main impacts that are easily monetised and came up with this. First, the hire cost. Based on 10 towers needed for 12 months, you can see, not surprisingly, that the the cost of the alternative options is higher than the standard towers. The delivery and pickup costs are the same for all options. The fuel costs are much lower for option 2 and even lower for option 3. And finally, the refuelling labour is also lower for the 2 alternatives, reflecting the lower use of diesel. Overall, on a purely financial basis, options 2 and 3 compare pretty favourably to option 1.
A 50 grand saving. That sounds great. But what about the other impacts? Have you looked at them as well?
Yeah, I took the CBA comparison and put that into a multi-criteria analysis along with the main other impacts. I used our standard weightings you'd be familiar with from previous projects, and here's what I came up with. So for the MCA, I made all the scores relative to standard light towers, the standard light tower option, hence it scores 0 for everything, so it's all a comparison. The environmental performance of option 3 is far superior due to the large reduction in greenhouse emissions, hence it scored really highly for this. And I rated the alternatives equally for community impacts and cost savings, since the cost savings the same since the CBA results were very similar.
I noticed that you rated reliability slightly lower for option 3. Why was that?
Well, this option's largely untested in construction projects as far as I can tell, so I've scored it down a bit here based on the risk of new technology. The overall result is that option 3 scores slightly higher than option 2.
Pause the case study there. Let's come back to the table, carry on with some of our detailed assessment tools. Complete economic analysis, or CEA. This is an economic analysis tool for calculating the net benefits less the costs, of options and including wider environmental and social impacts or externalities, all expressed in monetary units. This is suited to more complex problems and opportunities to extend CBA by bringing externalities into the assessment. We also have appraisal summary table. This is a format for summarising the results of an appraisal process, including financial and non-monetised benefits and costs. It's best suited to less complex problems and opportunities to support CBA by bringing the non-monetised quantitative and qualitative aspects into the assessment. And again, for the more detailed assessment, we can use the multi-criteria assessment or NCA again. It can also be used for more complex problems and opportunities to support CBA by bringing the non-monetised quantitative and qualitative aspects into the assessment and scoring key impacts. If you want further details on these tools, there is more information on them and their application in the how-to guide. Let's go back to the role play.
So Louis knows that the client's interested in reputational benefits and is keen to have some good data to show their management. So he takes the analysis further by undertaking a complete economic analysis. Louis sends the complete economic analysis, CEA, to the client by email and then rings them up to explain it. I've taken a complete economic analysis of the LED towers to better illustrate the business case. There were no social or environmental costs or negative impacts compared to standard towers. Social benefits included reputational, which are estimated equivalent to an advertisement in a trade magazine, say $5,000. Potential to win further work, estimated to be $10,000. Less community complaints to deal with, and reduced requirement for hearing protection for workers, resulting in less purchase of earplugs. So they're all the social benefits. On the environmental front, there are less greenhouse gas emissions, which are valued at $100 per tonne of CO2 equivalent, which is an estimated social cost of carbon. And there is less bulb replacement since LEDs last longer. This is a long-term benefit outside of the project construction period, so it won't all accrue to us. Some will flow on to the supplier. Overall, the net benefits increased from about 56,000, you'd recall in the CBA, up to 97,000 in the CEA, making both alternative options look even more attractive. It tells a pretty compelling story. Back to Nicole.
Thank you. So we're now on to step 6 and making a recommendation. We've been through defining the problem or opportunity, identifying key stakeholders and their drivers, identifying the various options, describing the impacts of the options, and then assessing the options. Time now to come towards the pointy end of the business case development and make a recommendation for a preferred option. The preferred option should be selected based on the outcomes of the assessment in the previous step, in which options will have been evaluated against predetermined criteria. The performance of each option against the criteria should be the primary determinant when selecting the preferred option. While the quantitative assessment may suggest that a certain option is preferred, there may be qualitative impacts which, when properly considered, suggest a different option. Such considerations may include strong stakeholder preferences, which have arisen through the engagement process, harking back to the second step, or practical limitations to implementation, such as availability of supply. Where such considerations impact on the preferred option, ensure that the justification for varying from the initial assessment criteria is clearly stated in the recommendation. When developing the recommendation for decision makers, think about and include the following: the context and background for the recommendation you're making, the key stakeholders that you have engaged, the assessment method used, how the outcomes of the assessment influenced the recommendation made, and the proposed path of action going forwards. Back to the conversation between Louis and Steve.
So which option do you recommend?
I recommend option 3, since it has even greater benefits than option 2, and both are far superior to standard light towers.
Well, you've done some really good work, practical analysis, and you've convinced me. I'm happy to sign off that decision subject to you preparing an action plan for implementation.
Great. I'll finalise the business case report and send it through with an action plan for your signing.
And following making a recommendation, we move swiftly on to the 7th step, outlining the action plan. The purpose of the action plan is to communicate the steps that will be taken should the recommendation be accepted and implemented. The value of preparing an action plan is that the decision maker can see what is anticipated. It should describe the key elements needed for delivery. So include the following key elements in your action plan: clarification of the budget and resources required to implement the proposal, the roles and responsibilities of people involved in implementation, timeline with key milestones associated with the implementation, a communication plan for key stakeholders that have been identified as being important to the delivery of the proposal, and clear deliverables and outcomes so that implementation progress can be monitored. The action plan, an example of which we have here and presented in the guide on page 28, should provide enough detail to instill confidence in the decision makers that the proposed investment has been appropriately considered and that the presented estimates are within an acceptable degree of accuracy. So we're at the final step. We've been through defining the problem or opportunity, identifying key stakeholders and their drivers, identifying the various options, describing the impact of the options, and then assessing the options, making a recommendation for preferred option, and developing and outlining an action plan. We're now at the point of preparing an executive summary. The executive summary is one of the most important parts of the business case presentation. It should be the quick look-up, go-to outline for busy decision makers on the most salient aspects of the whole business case. And less is most definitely more in this step. So what makes a good executive summary? For a good executive summary, remember the 3 C's: concise, concentrated, and compelling. Concise, keep it short and sharp. Concentrated, present just the most relevant information, distilling the key points from the business case. And compelling, what is the business need? What is the recommendation being made and why? Frame the business case in a language that will be understood by your intended audience and decision makers. The tangible, cost-focused element or elements of your business case should be outlined here clearly and prominently. This may be the CBA calculations or something like NPV calculations, but use whatever type of figure or data that are most important to the stakeholders and ultimate decision makers. Present this alongside the salient qualitative information, perhaps in an appraisal summary table, so that it can be understood as one overall picture. I've got an example here of how an executive summary should be presented, and this is also provided in the how-to guide. In presenting the information in the executive summary, it's important to remember to respect the intelligence of your decision makers too. If information is presented well, they are likely to make good decisions. The rest of the business case document or presentation can then contain the other relevant data and supporting information to verify and endorse that which is presented in the executive summary. So those are the 8 steps. So to recap for you, step 1, define the problem or opportunity. Define the business need, understand what the opportunities or problems to be addressed are. Step 2, identify your key stakeholders and their drivers. Understanding key stakeholders involved in decision making affected by the problem or opportunity and their priorities makes for a compelling business case. Step 3, identify the options. Defining what the options are to address the problem or opportunity. Step 4, describe the impact. This is identifying, describing and prioritising the tangible and intangible impacts of the options, both positive and negative. Step 5, assess the options. Assessing the options to address the problem, opportunity, and for relevant and material impacts identified, quantifying the impacts. Step 6 is making a recommendation. This is about selecting the preferred option or options and making a recommendation for decision makers. Step 7, outline the action plan. Document an action plan for obtaining approval, implementing and measuring the success of a given initiative. And finally, step 8, preparing the executive summary. This is a succinct and persuasive executive summary to engage decision makers. Now, there's a great level of detail and some fantastic worked examples through each and every step available to you in the how-to guide on the ISCA website, including the case study which the role play is based on. So if you've not done so already, I highly, highly recommend you hop onto the ISCA website and download your own copy.